Next, we are going to talk about shutter speed. In an earlier lecture, we talk about the faucet as a metaphor for the aperture and the shutter speed. You can choose to open the tap wide and let a lot of water flow, or you can open the tap just a bit and let the water trickle into the sink. When we think about light being like the water going into the sink, shutter speed is how long you leave the faucet running. As we will see in this picture, in this lecture, as we will see in this lecture, proper use of a slow shutter takes a picture from being a mere rendering of an event to being something iconic, something that goes far beyond the original movement. Next is experimenting with shutter speeds. A shutter speed of 1 by 500 of a second is literally 10 times faster than a speed of 1 by 50 of a second, but you can't hear the difference. Both are tiny amounts of time, nearly impossible to perceive. Yet, in still photography, the speed makes a world of difference. A field shoot of sparks created by grinding metal shows the difference between fast and slow shutter speeds. At a full second, the sparks are arcing everywhere. The image looks as if it was taken on the 4th of July. With the speed of 1 by 500 of a second, the sparks are still present, but they are not as exciting. Note that the camera was on tripod. The camera was on tripod and a cable released was used for this shoot. You want to slow the shutter speed down, but you don't want the whole scene to be moving. It's interesting to experiment with different speed, but while shooting flowing water. An image shot at 1 by 500 of a second shows individual water droplets suspended in air. In an image shot at 1 by 10 of a second, the water blurs together in a continuous stream. Next is use shutter speed purposefully. Most mid to advanced level cameras, film or digital, offer some way to control the shutter speed. If you are using an SLR or advanced point and shoot, the easiest way to start experimenting is by using shutter priority exposure mode. This is often indicated by an S for shutter and T for time, depending on what kind of camera you have. In shutter priority mode, you choose and control the shutter speed while the camera changes the aperture. This is simply a way of experimenting because you are letting the camera do the thinking when it comes to the exposure. You can then concentrate on the effect you want. A good rule of thumb for choosing shutter speed is this: the longer the lens, the faster the shutter should be. Use 1 by 20 of a second minimum for a 20 lens, 1 by 500 of a second or more for a fine 500 lens, and so on. Fast shutter speeds. A fast shutter speed means that the shutter is not left open for a very long. This is useful for capturing action such as sports or other fast moving subjects. The faster the subject and the closer it is to your camera, the faster the shutter speed must be to freeze it. Fast shutter speeds are more difficult to use simply because you have to fire the shutter at exactly the right moment, just as the action you want to capture occurs. Photos of sandhill cranes illustrate the result can be achieved with various shutter speeds. Image in which the birds are completely in focus are taken in plenty of light with a shutter speeds up to 1 by 6400 of a second. Next is in the other image, the heads and the bodies of the birds are fairly sharp, but their feet and wingtip are a bit blurred. blurred because those parts are moving more than the rest of the body. These images were taken with a shutter speed of 1 by 320 of a second, which allows both some sharpness and some movement. A shutter speed slowed down to 1 by 30 of a second makes for a dramatic images. Here the birds on the ground are fairly sharp, but the ones in the air are smudged and barely recognizable, mere impressions of cranes. The choices of shutter speed you make depend on what you are trying to achieve, how much of an artist you want to be, and how fast or slow the subject is moving. When you are shooting with fast shutter speed, anticipating the movement is crucial to getting the host shot. Generally speaking, with an SLR camera, if you see a fast breaking movement, you have probably missed getting a picture of it. Watch an event for a bit before you try to shoot it to get a sense of what will happen next and where. Slow shutter speed. Of course, a slow shutter speed means that the shutter is left open for a relatively longer period of time. Another world of creative possibilities opens up using slower shutter speeds. Used properly, a slow shutter can convey motion in a still image. Just a slight bit of blurring is all it takes for our brains to translate a still image into a moving one. After you have practiced for a while, you will discover that slow shutter speeds used well are surefire ways to add artistry to an otherwise unremarkable setting. Next is next is panned action images. A fun experiment to try with slow shutter speeds is to shoot a panned action images where you move the camera to follow the subject. In the final image, the subject is mostly in focus and the background is blurred. There are two ways to shoot a panned action picture. You can look at the picture which are given below. The first is with the photographer stationary and a moving subject. The second is with the photographer moving parallel to the subject at the same speed. It's often hard to find an opportunity to use the second technique. When you are the stationary photographer and your subject is moving, position yourself perpendicular at a 90-degree angle to the subject's path. Pre-focus on where your subject will be when it passes in front of you. Then follow the subject with the camera. Get a good start, shoot and follow through. Don't stop moving when you press the shutter or you are liable to ruin the smoothness of the long exposure. Next is panned action is something that only still photography can do well. It creates a beautiful blur in the background with the subject sharp, although it can be hit and miss. Make things easy on yourself by choosing the right subject. The faster your subject is moving, the better the pan will be. Behind the lens. Photographer said, hang out once in a while with the friends of mine. I hang out once in a while with a friend of mine, a daredevil named Dr. Danger. He is one of the last old time daredevils or stuntmen out there. Dr. Danger decided he was going to drive a junk car through a wall of flame into a pile of junk cars. That's great. We have this huge explosion. You can look in the photograph that needs a fast shutter speed 1 by 4000 of a second or so. I had the advantage of it being very strong light, bright daylight, and of course the explosion gave me another little burst of light, and it all resulted in a very fast shutter speed. Here is the picture, you can go through it. Next is finally embrace the blur. We are trained to think that images have to be sharp, but that does not always result in the best. In the second technique for shooting panned action, the camera is moving parallel to the subject at about the same speed. The camera does not move side to side but stays with the subject. Ghosting and long exposure. Yes. Next is combining a slow shutter speed with a flash and ambient light can create an effect of knowing as ghosting. No matter how many times you try this technique, you will get something different and unexpected. This technique involves dragging the shutter, which simply means choosing a very slow shutter speed in right order to gather as much light as possible. The is then introduced as a way to freeze something in the frame. Ghosting takes a lot of practice to do well, but again the results can be amazing. Much depends on the speed at which the subject is moving, the amount of ambient light available, and the right amount of flash. Long exposures can work well for shooting images that build up the light from the things like traffic, weather, and fireworks. Such exposures are the opposite of capturing a moment. They use very slow shutter speeds to show the passing of time. To take a long exposure image, you will need a tripod and way to trigger your camera without touching it. In situations where the light is very dim, longer, slower shutter speeds are a necessity. With practice, you can make them work to your advantage, shooting images of fireworks, for example, a thunderstorm. That's all for the day. Thank you so much.